The history of the popes of Rome and Christianity reaches into nearly every aspect of history. In the History of the Papacy podcast, we step over the rope. We dive in to discover more about the people, events, and background that define the influence of the popes of Rome and Church, not only on the West, but the world. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search for History of the Papacy on your favorite podcast platform.
They were some of the most powerful men who've ever lived. They waged war, forged peace, and altered the fates of billions of people. And yet, they were just as human, just as flawed as you and me. They were the presidents of the United States, and they are the subjects of the history podcast, This American President. In each episode of This American President, we explore how flawed men have managed this awesome responsibility. To listen now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search This American President on your favorite podcast platform.
This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
I guess we're going to start reviewing the Godfather, the movie, properly, right? We talked all about how it was made and casting choices and some of the history behind in terms of the actual mob involvement. Yeah, I don't think it's really up for much debate. Like, The Godfather is probably one of the greatest films ever made. It's definitely one of the most influential in terms of pop culture and how the mob viewed itself and how we view the mob. And I don't know, what do you guys think? I don't really think there's much of a debate about that.
No, not at all. I mean, it is one of the most important movies of all time. I would say, without a doubt, it's in my top 10, no question. It has been since the first time I saw it. I watched it again recently to talk about this episode. I mean, it's just a great movie.
So, like, if you guys were to rate the film, what would you give it out of 10?
Well, Steve makes a great point that it's one of the all-time greats. And I think on every list I've ever seen, like Casablanca and the Orson Welles movie, Citizen Kane, are the only two that seem to give it a run for the number one spot. It's usually one of those three. And this is by far the most recent. So how do you rate something like that less than, at least a 9, right? I mean, I think I would give it a 9 because I know we're not talking about the second movie, but I think I actually like it better. And so you got to have some place to go. So it's a 9 or a 9.5 for me.
Yeah, I would say 9.5. I mean, I'm a strict grader, so I can't give it a 10. And there's problems with it. Obviously, we can get into I'm sure we'll start talking about some of the problems, but there's some things that don't entirely make sense, don't line up with the book. I think where the book got it a little better, a couple of problems with the story, but overall, I would say I don't see how you could give it below a 9. And I'm a contrarian, as people know. I'll try and find something to go after, but it's really hard to find things in this movie.
Yeah, I would say I'd give it a 9. And I'd also argue too, where, there's arguments to say that the art is subjective, and in many ways it is, how it affects you individually on like an emotional level and intellectual level. But there are pieces of art where you can objectively say this is a great work of art, even though, say, something else maybe might have emotionally affected you more or moved you more. But it's, kind of looking at a picture, a statue of like Michelangelo, right? You can objectively go like, this is a great work of art. And I believe like The Godfather, I'm not comparing it to like Michelangelo, but I think we can get to the point where the art is so good that objectively you can't argue that it's bad art. Does that make sense to you guys? Like, I can't take somebody serious that says like The Godfather's a bad movie. Just simply not. It's a great movie. You know, you might not like it as much as another movie, but objectively speaking, this is probably one of the greatest films ever made.
Yeah, I mean, art has objective qualities to it. And as a society, we have kind of decided what it is about these pieces of art in whatever medium that we believe are quality, traits. And so, I mean, I could find somebody plausible if they gave The Godfather a 7. I wouldn't think they were crazy. I'd disagree with them, but I wouldn't think they were crazy. But somebody who gives it a 3, I don't believe they're being objective. No, I think there's a bandwidth of objective evaluation that you can do for most art. And then there's all the subjective parts to it. And that's where the I liked it, I didn't like it comes in. I mean, there are movies out there that I did not like that are objectively well made, good movies. I just didn't like them personally. So that may be the case for The Godfather for some people, but I'd be careful saying it because, it's The Godfather and they'll come talk to you about, about not liking them.
Yeah. I'll in my opinion, like I prefer Once Upon a Time in America, for various reasons. Even though sometimes it gets accused of the story being a little confusing because of the back and forth and some of the pieces not entirely fitting together. But in terms of like the music and the lighting and the set pieces and some of the acting, I prefer Once Upon a Time in America. They're about the same to me. I guess maybe that would be a controversial opinion. Most people would probably say, "Oh yeah, The Godfather's a far superior film." I mean, I'd say Once Upon a Time in America is pretty dang close, right? And fits within this conversation because we're talking about mob movies, right? What's a film that you guys would say was better than The Godfather?
I mean, that's hard to say. I think in the genre of mafia movies, there's mafia movies that I think maybe told the story better or maybe were truer to the events they were trying to say. Like I would say in a lot of ways that Goodfellas was more entertaining to me than The Godfather, but they were really different movies. I enjoyed Goodfellas more. I think Goodfellas kept my attention the whole span of the movie and I can watch it. Not that I can't watch The Godfather time and time again, but I can definitely watch Goodfellas time and time again and just thoroughly enjoy it from beginning to end. I thought The Godfather kind of dragged in a few spots. It was a little bit too maybe cinematic. If I'm making sense, it's too maybe trying to be too artsy and it's not gritty enough.
No, I totally get that. Where in some aspects I prefer Goodfellas because it shows, even though it still kind of glamorizes the mob to a degree, in a different kind of way. It shows it, it portrays it much more kind of realistically, but it's also taking place at a different time in the history of the mob. Me and you, Steve, have talked about this. Or there's definitely like a change. Like as soon as like kind of late 70s happened, mid 70s, there's definitely a change in how the mob operates. It becomes much more violent and dirty. Maybe that's just our perceptions. I mean, we talked about early history of the mob and how crazy it was in terms of like having shootouts in the streets and people like Dutch Schultz. But I can't help but shake like the, people like Roy DeMeo showing up and a couple of other guys. Vic Amuzzo is another guy. Not Vic Amuzzo. I'm trying to think of drawing a blank on his name. Gaspar Casso show up, and there's definitely like a change. It becomes much more kind of psychotic, and people are just ratting on each other in general much more frequently. And I think the Goodfellas captures that kind of time period of the mob. Me personally, I think the movie that really captures the mob perfectly is Donnie Brasco. I really do. Like in terms of how these guys are, it's like, yeah, some of them are kind of psychopaths, but a lot of these guys, you probably sit down and have a drink with them and whatever, but they're doing like, I don't know, like just dirty kind of work, like robbing like parking meters and stuff of that nature, like that famous scene in Donnie Brasco where he's smashing the parking meter and Sonny Black's screaming at him to stop. Like, a lot of ways, it's kind of what the mob is, where like The Godfather does a really good job of portraying a very stylized version of how the mob, I think, would like to view itself as opposed to what it actually is.
Oh, it's definitely way more romanticized than Donnie Brasco or Goodfellas or any of the more recent movies, Casino. And you're right. It's much more the way that they would like to see themselves, but it's from an earlier time too. So nostalgia, is a major factor as well. I think it's like, it's like, do you like opera or do you like rock and roll? I mean, is this opera better than this rock song? I mean, how can you say one way or the other? You might like one more than the other because of your preference, but it's pretty difficult to gauge, which is better because the mediums are so different, So I don't know if I know a movie that's better than The Godfather. I just know there are movies I maybe like more, and some that are just as well made. But it's, there's, like I said, there's a subjective bandwidth in there too. After you get past those objective things like set design and acting and choreography and, cinematography, that.
Yeah, I'll just like kind of random. Like I'll use an example. Like my favorite film of all time probably is Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me. And at the time that it came out, people hated it, and it's still very controversial to this day. And my argument to these people is like, you just don't get it. Like I don't understand how people can look at that film within the context of having watched the TV show and everything like that. Because if you try to watch the film without watching the TV show, none of it will make any sense. I don't understand how people can watch it and go not be like emotionally just battered with a sledgehammer, because it's so like emotionally horrific and moving. I've never had a movie like that move me quite like that, but people hated it when it came out.
Maybe look at apples to apples. Like if you try and compare the old Dune to the new Dune, the old Dune is so bad compared to the new Dune. I feel like watching the old Dune, he didn't really get what Dune was all about. Where I think Denis Villeneuve really did get Dune, and he got the bigness of Dune, and he got that you had to split it up into two movies. You could not jam it all into one movie with the casting. I mean, everything just apples to apples.
Well, no, it's funny not to get too off topic, but like when David Lynch was given that movie Dune, like the way they looked at it was like, well, this guy's like good at like directing weird stuff. And, Dune by its nature is kind of a weird sci-fi story because it's not like a traditional sci-fi story. There's like mysticism and like religious symbolism and all that type of stuff in it. So they figured, David Lynch would be great at it. And he absolutely hated directing it. He said like, I'd never do a big budget studio film ever again after his experience doing that, even though I would argue that the film turned out still quite well in some parts. And he stuck to it. He's never done one ever since. I don't know what they were thinking when they hired him, because I mean, like, you just have to sit down and talk to David and be like, yeah, I don't know if this is really going to work out well with him, because you could watch interviews with David. He's a weird guy, man. It's not somebody I would entrust $40 million or whatever they spent on that movie. I don't know if it's that much, but it was at the time, it was a huge budget movie.
Dune is an interesting one to bring up, Steve, because, that book is so dense in terms of layers. I mean, there's political intrigue, there's relationship intrigue, there's, internal and external politics going on, there's geology and climatology going on, there's religion as and mysticism, as Chris said. There's the idea of colonialism and the indigenous peoples that gets explored. I mean, and I'm probably leaving out ton of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to unpack such a dense novel into a film, even a long film, 2.5 hour, 3 hour film is pretty tough. Now, I would not say The Godfather as a novel was as dense as Dune. There were not as many layers. It wasn't as complex, but it wasn't a simple, bubblegum sort of novel. I mean, it wasn't something you read on the beach and only, pay half attention to. Like, you could miss 5 paragraphs and still know what's going on. It wasn't that light of fare. And they definitely, when they adapted it, they still had to leave a bunch of stuff out. Now, some of it I think was worthy of leaving out, and we've talked about that before, but they still captured a lot of the really important pieces when they made this film, and made some incredible scenes that are just, I think, memorable as like iconic film scenes. If you assembled, the best ones from the history of film, there'd be half a dozen from this movie that you'd have to include.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
Chris, you wanted to talk a little bit about the historical accuracy of the movie. I guess for one thing, do you think that historical accuracy was the aim of the book? And being that the book was written essentially in the time when a lot of these things were happening, do you think that, well, maybe we'll start to dissect the historiography, you might say, of it. Maybe just talk about, do you think that after reading the novel, do you think that Puzo was going for accuracy? Or, where do you think accuracy fits in with this film?
Well, I mean, as we all know, there's nothing real about The Godfather, literally nothing. It's all a fictional story, right? But Mario Puzo took pains. We talked about this earlier, in researching how the mob ran and the history of the mob. And at the time that it came out, it felt authentic to people reading it. And when the film came out, it felt real. And I mean, one of the reasons was a lot of the stuff that Mario Puzo pulled out from his research was real. It was authentic. Samuel Bolgravano was pretty convinced that there was no way that he could have written that book without having a mob guy feeding him some inside information or not. Mario Puzo denies that. He says, I read newspaper articles, I read journalists, academic papers, and he devoured all of that. I mean, I don't know, it's up for debate whether he actually had a mob guy or not. He denies it, so I don't know. He's never lied to me, so I have no reason not to believe him. He seems like an honest guy from everything that I've read. So, but one of the things that he does, that he got pretty bang on, was how the 5 families worked in the commission. And it's depicted in the movie. And I guess I'll pull up one of the scenes that's really depicts it really well is with Don Corleone. He calls for a meeting with the rest of the families after his son, Sonny, was brutally murdered, and probably one of my favorite scenes, but we'll get into that later. And the purpose of the meeting was to put an end to the war that started earlier. And this is generally kind of how the commission ran. This is kind of how the 5 families ran, where they'd have a big issue, say, and I'll use an example from real life, say somebody like Dutch Schultz, which was one of the first big decisions that the commission had to make. they didn't know what to do with this guy, Dutch. He was flying off the handle. He was kind of doing his own thing. Said he was going to kill Thomas Dewey, who was the attorney at the time. And the commission decided, well, we're going to sit down and have a meeting about what we're going to do with this guy. And, they came to the conclusion that we're going to kill Dutch, and, the rest is history. But even within the context of our own story, we talked about Joe Colombo and his Italian Civil Rights League and how it related to this movie. Now, the general theory is that maybe the commission sat down and had a meeting with the rest of the family members, heads of the family, and they decided, you know what, Joe Colombo's not getting it. He's not shutting down the Italian Civil Rights League, and it's bringing way too much attention to the mafia and us. So we're going to hire Jerome Johnson to kill Joe Colombo, and by extension to make it look like, oh, maybe Joe Gallo did it, because Jerome Johnson was African American and Joe Gallo was known for hanging out with them. And Joe Colombo and Joe Gallo already had beef with each other. I generally leave that theory. And the movie depicts this perfectly, where, you got all the heads of the family and they decide on what they're going to do about a certain situation. It could be, in this movie, it's like a war going on between the families, which isn't very historically accurate, but, and say 3 families could decide what's going to happen with one family that's maybe going through a civil war. I mean, that happened numerous times with the Bonanno family and the Colombo family, who are typically the most dysfunctional of the 5 families. This is how the commission ran, and it ran very effectively for most of its history.
And that really is, I think that was something that they really did have to capture in the movie, is that whole idea of the commission. It makes for a really dramatic story.
And this is the authenticity that people talked about, because it feels like you're sitting at an actual commission meeting that happened. I don't know. What do you think, Frank?
I think that you guys are way more schooled on this history than I am. I'm a history guy, but the mob has never been an area that I studied. So I would sound foolish if I tried to comment on what you're saying in terms of agreeing or disagreeing. But I will say that I think that they did a great job in this film of appearing historically accurate where those interactions between the families is concerned. I mean, I'm not an expert on it, and it felt plausible to me. It felt like this is, it's romanticized and it's a little more grand than for real, but I felt like it was something that was believable. And so I think that Puzo, I don't know if he was reaching to be historically accurate, but he definitely was reaching to appear historically reasonable or historically adjacent, at least. And as someone who doesn't know the history, he definitely landed there. Now, if you know the history and he made mistakes that kind of clang for you, that's totally reasonable.
Well, another thing that he does really well too is he shows that each one of the families kind of had a specialty. Now, all the families in New York historically, they were all involved in all the same stuff, right? Racketeering, gambling, extortion, they all did this, right? But certain families would have specialties that they would get involved in. The Gambino family was always heavily involved in construction. Concrete Club, really. They didn't run it. All the members of all the families were involved in the concrete scam. The Gambino family was heavily involved in that. And the Lucchese family was always heavily involved in the unions, particularly the Teamsters. And the Bonanno family always had close ties to drug trafficking, right from the get-go. They were one of the few families that said there was no quote unquote ban. They all dealt drugs, right? Just some families would, I don't know, they would kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. Paul Castellone would be telling everybody, in the Gambino family, don't deal drugs at the death sentence, but certain people were allowed to do it. For the Bonanno family, there was none of that. They just openly talked about dealing drugs all the time. We talked about this on our previous episode. They there was no ban whatsoever with the Bonanno family. And it shows that in this movie. I believe one of the families they talk about specializes in prostitution, and another family specialized in something else. I can't remember right off the top of my head.
Tattaglia, wasn't it? That was the prostitution family. I wonder if the reason they did that is because if I have my area and you have your area and you have your area, we're not going to step on each other's toes as much. We can all make money. We're just going to make it from a different revenue stream, and then we don't have as much to fight about. This seems like a smart thing to do when you're doing something that's not governed by the law, and therefore your recourse is basically negotiate or shoot them up. But it seems like they almost had like a designated family, like almost like a caste system, like how in some cultures there's like the untouchables, who do the things that, they work with sewage or cut meat or whatever it is that the culture deems is, beneath the average person. And maybe that's what the mafia is doing with the drug dealers. Somebody's got to sell drugs. So it's just going to be this crappy little family over here. And then we can say we don't do it. We can take the high road and we don't have to fight them for a piece of the prostitution or gambling or, other bits of pie that we're all got our thumbs in.
Well, that's definitely the Bonanno family, right? They're definitely the dirtiest family of them all. I don't think Steve would argue with me too much on that one.
I was thinking about what you said about Sammy the Bull Gravano saying that he must have had insider knowledge. And that just seems to me big Sammy bravado again, that, you have to have some insider knowledge. I don't think that there was anything at that point when Puzo wrote this novel that really any of this was major secrets that he divulged in the movie. I think that reading what Valachi said, and maybe talking to a couple of people who are keyed in the media, like you said, or in the police department, the NYPD, I think he could have gotten all these broad brushstrokes of the mafia without having an insider. Maybe he did interview an insider, but I don't know how much an insider would have given him more than what the basics of the story give us.
See, I would kind of believe Sammy to a degree if Joe Valachi hadn't happened yet. But once Joe Valachi started talking, it was all out in the open, really, right? That was why Joe Valachi is so famous, is because unlike, Abe Rellis talked a lot too. We talked about it on our Murder Inc. miniseries. Abe Rellis didn't really divulge into how the organization ran, where that's what made Joe Valachi different in the sense of, he wasn't murdered, but and so he got to talk the entire time. But he actually went into like the organizational structure of how the mob worked with the head of the family and then the capos, and how there was like layers of protection, and then like the history of how this came about, how the commission worked, and all the 9 yards, right? Abe Rellis never did that. If Mario Puzo had written his book and, this was all in it, and Joe Valachi hadn't came about, it'd been like, yeah, he definitely talked to somebody. But once Joe Valachi started talking, all this stuff was out in the open.
I was thinking of something and that you mentioned about the layers of protection, and I think this is in Frank's wheelhouse. It's almost the inversion of what we expect in America, where the higher you are up, the more responsible you are, or if there's a mistake or if there's problems, that at least in theory, the higher you up, if you're in the military or if you're in the police or if you're in a government or in a company, our cultural hope is that even if somebody lower down makes a mistake, that person at the top is going to take responsibility for it and fix it, where the mafia is built on this very different ideal that if somebody at the lower ranks makes a mistake, the whole organization is set up as insulation so that the people higher up don't get in trouble and don't have to own the people at the bottom's mistakes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But the reason for that's pretty clear too, right? What's the biggest threat to the overall existence of the crime family. It's not another crime family. They're a problem. They're something you have to deal with. They cause issues, but it's very unlikely that one crime family is going to completely, destroy another crime family. But law enforcement could take down the entire crime family, and so they're almost like terrorist cells in that they find ways to compartmentalize and to insulate, like you said. And the other thing I guess I would say is you set up what the ideal would be. We both know that a little bit of I might be in charge, but it wasn't my fault happens in a lot of different organizations. And it's unfortunate, but true. But yeah, it is the inverse of what we would expect or what we would idealize as Westerners. That's a good point.
Yeah, like you said, it is our ideal, and I think ideals are important, even though we don't often live up to ideals. I'm sure we could all list off many examples of the ideal not happening, and I think that came, Salvador Maranzano even said that he based it on the Roman military, and that was built into their whole schema, was that lower level people screwed up, and so that higher level people wouldn't have to feel the brunt of the lower level screw ups. And so even in their fundamental systems, their legalized legal systems, they were building in those layers of protection, and that kind of got transported here. And it was, like you said, it was cellular, and as a way to keep everybody, if one cog broke down, it didn't throw off the whole thing.
Yeah, you don't have to kill them because they don't know enough to hurt anybody too far above them. And so, and they went to great lengths, I think, to create plausible deniability, leaving a meeting before the details were discussed, even though they had given explicit instructions to their underlings, that sort of thing.
Well, that's what made Rudy Giuliani's use of the RICO laws so brilliant. And now we can have a debate whether RICO laws are good laws or bad laws, right? They were effective in terms of taking down the mob, right? Because he rightfully saw, many other people did too. It's like, well, how can we prove a conspiracy so we can actually get to these guys at the top? Because by the time we get up the ladder, these guys aren't getting their hands dirty in anything. So we can take out like as many low-level guys as we want. We're not really doing any damage to the organizational structure that they set up. That's slightly a tangent, but trust me, we're going to be talking a lot about Rudy Giuliani and the RICO laws down the road.
One thing that I thought was interesting about the movie, and I wonder if what you thought of that is going more deep into the history, Chris, is the Tatalias, they kill Sonny, and then the family, I think first Sonny kills one of the Tatalia sons, and then eventually the Tatalia family kills Sonny, and Vito's willing to just make bygones be bygones for that. In the mafia, did they really do that? Or when somebody important was killed in the family, they went all the way to the wall to get revenge?
Well, we could use an example where Vito Genovese tried to kill Frank Costello, right? Almost did it, if he had just shot him slightly, a couple inches, he would have blown his head right off, but the bullet grazed him, and Frank Costello was just like, you know what? I'm out. I made my money. I don't want like a big war breaking out in the Genovese family. You can take it over. And it was peaceful transfer of power, even though he tried to kill him. That was unique to the Genovese family. That probably wouldn't have happened in the Bonanno or the Colombo family, as we have discussed earlier. So there's examples of it where somebody's looking at the bigger picture and go like, well, if we let this whole break out into a major war, it's going to cause all different types of problems. And that's the character they try to portray. Corleone he's the type of guy that sees the big picture of everything, right? Because he knew if this war continued, maybe Michael is going to get killed and a bunch of other of his family members are going to get killed. And it kind of leads into another thing that they got pretty accurately. It's mentioned in the movie, but they never really talk about it in detail. Like the whole family system and the whole commission system, the way it's set up, came about because of a major war that Corleone was involved in. And he saw firsthand how bad these major family wars between the families can get to, and how many people will end up dying, and these aren't like, abstract people. A lot of the times, like, this is my cousin, or this is the guy that I grew up with my entire life, or my son in his case. So yeah, I mean, there's examples of it where, somebody with enough foresight realizing, yeah, he might have killed my son, or he might have tried to kill me, but big picture perspective, a lot more people are going to die if we keep on going down this road.
I also think you could argue that Don Corleone is playing the long game here. Like he is being pragmatic. Sonny is dead. He can't bring him back. So, revenge is a dish best served cold. And getting Michael back from Sicily is, of paramount importance to him. And that's, in fact, one of the, if I remember right, and that was a key piece of the negotiations at that meeting, was that the Tattaglias or the Barzinis or both would guarantee Michael's safety as he came home. And so I think he's being very pragmatic. And you're right, Chris, he's a guy who can see the big picture. I guess I would suggest that maybe he saw an even bigger picture. Like he's looking into the future, like we're going to get our revenge, but it's going to be cold. It's going to be down the road a bit. First I need to lick my wounds here, and I need to get my son back and get things squared away. And that takes some ice in the veins, because I mean, his kid was killed, and his loss was the more recent loss of the two fathers. So, it's a pretty neat nuance if it's true.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, another thing that the movie does really well is we talked about it tangentially earlier, but in terms of how the family actually worked, like the organizational structure, where you had like the Godfather, who was at the top, and then you had like his consigliaries, which were his advisors, and that would be like Sonny and Tom Hagen, and Michael wasn't in the family at the time that they're discussing it, but it would have been, say, somebody like Michael. And then you have like your capos who like ran crews, and then your soldiers. I mean, Mario Puzo obviously got most of that from the Valachi hearings and his personal reading, but it's accurate. This is pretty much how the mob ran. The soldiers do the grunt work. The capos make sure that the soldiers are actually doing the grunt work. The capos talk to the consigliaries about the issues that they're having. The consigliaries go talk to the Don about the issues that the capos are having. I mean, runs much like, say, a modern, business runs, or at least a well-functioning one.
All right. Well, you ready to talk about our favorite scenes? I know I'm looking forward to it. I'm ready.
All right, I'll do the first one. And I put my three in chronological order. So I think one of my first favorite scenes is the scene at the wedding where Michael is sitting with Kay and he tells her the story of the band leader and making an offer that can't be refused. And then he utters the line, "I'm not my father, Kay." I think that's a very quietly powerful scene. And we talked about this before, the way Pacino's delivery, that coldness that he has as Michael Corleone, the Godfather, is already present in Michael Corleone, the soldier and civilian, soon to become civilian, sitting there at the wedding. It's packaged a little differently and directed in a different direction, but it's still there. So I that's one of my favorite scenes. It's one of my quietly favorite scenes.
I think the whole thing about Michael and his experience in the war, and they set up the dichotomy between being a mafia hitman and getting up close and killing someone. But you have to imagine if Michael was in any of the actions that Marines saw in the Pacific, he saw horrors that are absolutely unimaginable. And I liked in the movie and in the book that they didn't really explain that to us. I think they invited us to think about that. If you knew something about World War II history and the Marines in the Pacific, it would have been too much of a tangent to have Michael mulling over that. It would have, if Mario Puzo got his hands on that, it would have been 5 chapters interspersed throughout the novel of Michael thinking about the war. But I think they did invite us to think about that.
Just by having him wear his uniform, you know, I think that it was a subtle way of spurring us down that thought path.
Well, on mine, I guess it's more than one scene, but just the whole wedding scene, it set up the whole movie. It invited us in and it gave us the exposition. We got to meet all of the important characters. I think the one scene that really stuck with me from the wedding scene was when Don Corleone is taking in his clients, I guess you might say, his visitors, where he's hearing all of their wants on his wedding day, and he's playing with the cat. And I thought that was really, and I never really thought about that, probably the 2 dozen times that I've seen the movie, but it humanized him, but then he's talking about killing people at the same time. I thought that they set up a really interesting visual with that.
Sorry, fun fact about that cat was that was just a cat that was just roaming around on set, and he picked it up, and they're like, where's that cat from? And he's like, oh, we don't know. And then he's like, Francis Ford Coppola is like, that's perfect. And then they filmed him playing with the cat. It wasn't even supposed to be in the movie.
The other part of that is just a small little piece, but it's so fun, is when they coax the Mama Corleone into singing the dirty song with what's the guy's name? He's Petrangelo, or is that his name? Petrangelo? He has a bigger role in the second movie, but they sing something dirty in Italian. I can't tell you what it is because I don't speak Italian, but you can tell by the way everybody laughs that it was at least a play on words, that it was, double entendre or something. Just really captured the humanity of the wedding. They're all just regular people in that moment, that could be the Smiths or the Svens or the Dunkeldiemers, it just happened to be an Italian wedding.
Well, it's the authenticity of it too, right? Where that's how Italian weddings are. I mean, maybe not that big, but my dad was a plumber, so I kind of grew up around like Italians, in and out of the house and stuff like that. And that's how they are.
Did you know Mario?
Yeah. My dad was like a short guy too, right? So that was like always kind of like the joke. It was like, oh, he was actually Super Mario when we were kids. But so like, yeah, I had like Italians in and out of the house and stuff like that all the time. And, vague memories. We were like really young going to like a wedding, like an Italian wedding. And I mean, obviously much smaller, but it's like that, like everybody's like talking and everyone's like dancing and, like the money slips and everything like that. Like I remember that, and just tons of food, never ending. It just felt authentic because it was, right? For the most part, like the majority of the people there were Italians and just doing what Italians would do at a big wedding like that, and kind of a side note on that whole wedding scene is they kind of based it. A lot of the shots were based on, it was Joe Profaci's niece, and I believe it was Joe Bonanno's son were getting married. I could begin that. I know like Joe Profaci and Joe Bonanno, like it was their two of their family members were getting married, and it was a big wedding like that. And they showed in the movie with like the guys taking pictures, like the media guys. Well, that's what the cops did. was just take tons of pictures of this wedding because it was just right out in the open, and nobody was really talking about organized crime, the mob, as being a serious issue at the time. So they had tons of pictures from this wedding, and Francis Ford Coppola used a lot of these pictures from that wedding to give him an idea of how would a big mob wedding come about, look like. And yeah, I mean, just lends more to the authenticity of the whole wedding scene, which is, it's not just me saying that. A lot of people have said it just feels real. It doesn't feel like you're watching a film.
I love how Sonny comes out and gets mad at those guys and breaks one of their cameras and throws it on the ground, and then rips off a few bills and throws them on the ground too, and stalks away. I mean, what great characterization. You want to talk about show, don't tell. I mean, that tells you who Sonny is, right? Shows you who Sonny is right there.
Absolutely. All right, Chris, what was your one of your favorite scenes?
I gotta say, where Sonny is beating up that guy on the streets for for hitting his sister, and it just felt real. I mean, in some ways, it was real, because apparently the guy that he was beating up, in the scene where he's roughing up the girl, he was being too real, and she got really upset. And apparently James Caan heard about this, and he's like, they basically asked him, it's like, oh, can you just kick it up a notch a little bit? So then a lot of what you're seeing on that screen is James Caan, taking some liberties with them. But it just kind of perfectly exemplifies the mob, really, at its core, and family. It's like, oh, I'm just gonna, like, you hit one of us, I'm just gonna ratchet it up to 20, or 11, or I'm trying to remember that Spinal Tap reference. And it just felt real, because I've seen stuff like that on the streets. Frank, you being a cop, I'm sure you've seen it too. Like a street fight breaks out and it's like a mismatch, and you kind of feel bad for the guy getting the crap kicked out of him, and then you find out later, it's like, oh yeah, he probably deserved it. Maybe he learned something from it or not. I just loved it. I think it's great, and his acting in that scene is great.
Doesn't he grab the garbage can lid and hit him with the garbage can lid at some point?
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm not a huge fan of James Caan, like, acting per se. Like, I like some of the movies he's been in, but for this role, he was amazing. Upon, like, rewatching the film a couple of times for this podcast, he was incredible. Most of my favorite scenes are with him, actually.
Well, my second favorite scene is another quiet scene. It's the one in which Michael and Don are sitting outside against that rock wall on the bench. I feel like it was near the garden, but I could be wrong. And they're talking strategy, and you see so many little subtle things in that little short scene. For instance, the Don tells him, whoever comes to you with the deal, that's the traitor, and so you see that the Don is still on top of things. He's still playing the long game that I was talking about earlier. He's just, completing that arc. But then you hear Michael, almost irritated about it, say, yeah, I got it, Pop. Like, he's obviously way dialed in now on this new role as mafioso. And then you see the kind of beginnings of Don Corleone slipping too, because he, the reason that Michael was a little irritated maybe was that he had just told him that like 10 minutes ago or something. And the Don's like, oh yeah, we talked about that. So his mind's slipping a little bit. So you get that hint that he's growing, older, and maybe, is reaching a point where he's not going to be able to, he won't be able to be the guy, even if he wanted to be, now that he's passed it on to Michael. So it's just a really subtle scene that kind of shows so many things at once in just a few lines of dialogue. And of course, it's superbly acted by the two actors in the scene. So that's another one of my favorite scenes. Now, of course, I don't think any of us are picking like the favorite scenes that everybody would pick, because those are the obvious ones, that people are going to pick. So I feel like we're being a little bit more selective here of what scenes we're picking. But I guess that remains to be seen. Steve?
My scene, as speaking of that, of the picking the top scenes, I really enjoyed. So there was the scene where Michael shoots the police officer, the captain, and Barzini. It was the scene. It was either
Salazzo.
or Salazzo. Yeah, it was either one scene or two scenes before that where they're talking about it. It's Tom Hagen is there, Sonny is there, and they're talking about Michael Dewitt. They're all sitting around eating. It felt it could have been a serious scene of them, but it's almost mirthful talking about that, about how Sonny had made his bones and the way Sonny ate. Like he ate like a real mafia guy, shoveling in pasta and eating the bread and everything and drinking wine at the table.
Talking with his mouth full.
Exactly. Talking with his mouth full of food. And then you see that Michael's a bit more reserved and Tom Hagen is more reserved. And you see all these different personalities playing. And I thought that was just a really fun scene. And it really did move the plot forward in a fun way.
Yeah, it's so much characterization there.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, yeah, it really does it just shows, it just feels authentic, right? It feels like how a family would be acting with each other. I mean, yeah, granted, the situation is a little different than what most families are dealing with, but they're still brothers, you know, they still grew up together. And it feels like a real family because the acting is done so well and the directing, obviously, and, a bunch of other factors like we talked earlier, but like some of the historical accuracy in the film and how the actual mob ran, and yeah, like it feels real. I mean, this is why it's one of the greatest films ever made. You know, it doesn't feel like you're watching acting; it feels like you're watching an actual family.
And to your point, both yours and Steve's, you know, it's a long movie. And while it does drag in a couple of places, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that where it drags should have been cut. It's almost like that's the natural rhythm of the story. It's going to drag a little bit here, but it's necessary. I don't feel like there's any shots in there that are unnecessary or wasted. And part of the reason for that is because of scenes like the one you just picked out, Steve, where there's so many things happening at once, and characterization is just one of them. But the characterization that is accomplished there is just, it's stellar. It's stellar. You could watch just that scene and do you know who Michael is, who Sonny is, who Tom Hagen is. And they're true to that both before and after that scene throughout the movie. So it's really well done. Good choice.
Yeah. I guess for my next scene would be, where Sonny shot up. I guess maybe that would be a more typical favorite scene, but I just like how visceral it is. Like The Godfather's not a violent film. But when the violence is on screen, it's like a 10. Like is the best way I can describe it. Or there's long stretches where there's nothing violent happening. You know, it's not like people are swearing all the time. Like we talked about the Goodfellas earlier, where contrasted with Goodfellas, and that's just right from the get-go. It's just someone's getting beat up, somebody's swearing, people are screaming and yelling. There's something violent always, like, seems like it's happening all the time. And you guys talked about a dragon. There's like long periods where nothing happens, but when it does happen, it's very visceral. I like it because, especially for the time, this must have been really shocking to people because he must get shot up, like at least he must get like 100 bullets in him, right? You know, and he falls out of his car and he's on the ground, and the guy comes up and he shoots him point blank a couple of times, and then he kicks him in the face. You know, that was really necessary? Was they kicked the guy just shot 100 times in the face? It was really shocking to me, and I guess on a primal level, it was kind of exciting. It's like, holy crap, you know, they just shot a guy up 100 times. I mean, James Caan must have been pretty nervous shooting that scene because at that time they're still using squibs, which are pretty safe, but you know, they're not connected properly, they can really hurt you, and they're firing blanks too, right? So, I mean, we know. I'm trying to think of the guy, Brandon Lee, the Crow, right? Was a blank that was shot too close, and that's what killed him.
No, actually, I think what happened there was they had dummy rounds in to make it look like it was loaded for a scene, and then they were switching it out to shoot it, and the tech guy left the dummy round end in there and then put in the blank. So it essentially was like a really weak actual bullet in a way. It wasn't, up as tight and crimped and like a real bullet would be, but there's still, a projectile in there, and there's an explosion behind it with some pressure, obviously, because of confined space. And it had enough power to unfortunately kill him. So it was mismanaged use of blanks, which when you've got 4 guys shooting machine guns, the odds of that seem pretty high to me. So I think you're right. I think James Caan probably had a drink or two and made sure his will was in order before he shot that scene, it looks realistic too. I mean, I think it's for 1970, 73, 74, whatever it was. Well, I don't think it looks as good as anything today. Don't you think?
As a kind of a side to that, there was that one recently with Alec Baldwin. To me, it's incomprehensible that we're filming or recording this in 2023, that in 2023, actual live ammunition would be allowed within a mile of where they're and I did think technically the guns aren't supposed to be pointed at the people legally, and they're supposed to be blast shields. They're supposed to be in that case, every single fail-safe failed. And to me, I don't know why they're not even required by law. I mean, they'll argue, the filmmakers, that it doesn't make as good of a shot if they're not doing it with blanks or with other, where it's an analog shooting of the gun. But that should be CGI now. I'm sorry. You might have to give up a little bit of authenticity, but it just seems to me like, for just as a safety factor, that it has to be gone where they're shooting these the dummy rounds and putting on and doing that sort of thing.
In defense of the directors, though, I mean, nothing beats squibs. I mean, most of the stuff now is CGI, but the squibs just look so much better. And they're going off. They still haven't been able to. I believe most of John Wick, it's all CGI, like the blood and sprays and everything like that. But like you watch earlier podcast we had done for Beyond the Big Screen, where we talked about RoboCop, and the squibs in RoboCop it just looks good. I mean, I think you're right though, Stu. I think most of it is CGI now. I think they still use blanks, but most of the squibs going off and stuff like that, I believe, is CGI. I could be wrong about that. I don't know. Do you know, Frank?
I don't know. It makes sense to me that they would use CGI where they can, but CGI isn't cheap. So, I mean, practical effects sometimes are more affordable and sometimes look better. Like the scene that you picked here with Sonny. Speaking of which, did you find too that some of the power of that scene is like, if you didn't know it was coming, it's a big surprise, I mean, You think he's going to go lay another beating down on Carlo, and you're looking forward to it. And he pulls up to that toll booth. And then as soon as the toll booth operator ducks, you're like, nope.
Yeah.
And then it's pretty, I mean, even when it's coming, it's pretty intense.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, that's it too, right? And then it fits with his character too, where Sonny should have kind of known that he shouldn't be by himself, right? But that's who Sonny was, right? He was like a bull in a china shop. Like, I'm the toughest guy in the room. I'm going to take him on. And, in most cases, one-on-one, he probably is the toughest guy in the room, right? But, you're in the middle of a mob war. You need backup. You're not just like a nobody. You're not a soldier. You're one of the top guys in the family, of course they're going to target you, especially after, with your temperament, you've probably pissed off a lot of people in terms of, beating them up and, saying stuff to them and vice versa.
Yeah, they were definitely playing on his temperament there by setting that trap. And really that leads into my third favorite scene. I was really tempted to choose the scene where Michael gets Carlo to confess that it was him. The way he goes about that is so classic. And then I was tempted to say, no, my favorite scene is going to be when he tells Connie, or maybe he tells Kay, one or the other, that nothing's going to happen to Carlo. I wouldn't do that to my sister's husband. Da, 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 da. And then, of course, he gets garroted and he kicks out the windshield and all that. Those are both great scenes. But I think the through thread there is Michael and his ability to lie so well and to not feel any guilt for it. And I think that culminates in the very final scene where he lies to Kate, and then he goes into the room and they kiss his finger. And then you get that picture of Kate realizing, and then the door closes on her, and fade to black kind of thing. That's such a powerful ending to a movie. I mean, it's a little cerebral. It's not a bang, bang ending, but it has a lot of punch. And so I'm going to say that's my other favorite scene, is the very final minute or so. And I know we're not talking about the second movie here, but spoiler, if we ever do, one of my three favorite scenes is also the final shot in that movie too, with the leaves blowing and a sweep up to Michael sitting in the chair all alone, looking forlorn and miserable and so forth. Coppola, in both of those movies, he really found a way to nail the final shot.
I like that. That is such a great scene that you point out, because it's so different from the book too. It's like Coppola understood how the book should have ended. And maybe it's a way that you really couldn't even end the book. It is one of the most powerful endings of a movie, because it's like throwing all the cards on the table. Now we know everything, and Kay knows everything. Nothing's left unturned after that ending where everybody's kissing his hand.
Didn't the book end with her going to the church to pray for her husband's soul?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same kind of thing, but it just wasn't as much of a smack in the face, right?
The thing that's always bothered me about that kind of scene, though, is I understand why Kay is upset, because Michael lied about, what he did. I don't get it. Like, you know what I mean? Like, he ratted him out. I don't know. What do you want me to tell you? Sonny's dead is because
killed
of
her
her
husband.
I know, but I mean, you know what I mean? But like, Sonny's dead because of him. Like, what would you like me to do? I don't know. Does that make sense?
I'll tell you, Chris, from it does, but from going on multiple domestic violence calls in my career, I can tell you that where family and marriages are concerned, it is rarely logical. It rarely makes sense where and even the emotions themselves don't make sense. So I didn't have any problem with Connie's reaction, because I'd seen it before, when somebody beat, then it's happened many times with people smacking their wives, and the wives, you go to arrest the husband and the wife jumps on your back to stop it. It's not uncommon. So I totally get where you're coming from, and I totally understand why it could happen at the same time.
It just always kind of bothered me a bit, where it's just like, I don't get it, man. Like, Kay, I get it, because he wasn't completely honest with her, and the way she interpreted that, it's like, well, what else? And if you're being dishonest about something this important, like, what else are you going to be dishonest about? Do I even know you? Type. Like, I get it from her perspective. His brother's dead because your husband was a piece of. Sorry, I don't want to use foul language, but you know what I mean? Like, I would have been like, I would have been flabbergasted if I was Michael. I'd be like, I couldn't have stayed calm and cool like he did. I would have been like, are you for real? Like, wake up.
Well, I think that Connie she fundamentally didn't know or understand who Michael was. I think that was a big part of the whole movie, is that nobody understood. They didn't want to believe, maybe they didn't want to believe, or they didn't believe that Michael had the qualities of who he would become. It was such a gradual change in him, his metamorphosis from being a war hero, not somebody who had absolutely no interest in the operations of the family, like zero, zilch nada, and he just starts slowly filling that role of the father, and he fills the role in a different way than Vito. He really was more cutthroat in a way than Vito would have. Like Vito would have probably have never killed Carlo.
You make a great point there, Stephen. And I think you can include Michael in that group of people who didn't know or want to believe, that Michael had what it took to be who he became. I mean, I think he was denying it himself, and Connie as well, of course, and Kay's totally, she's poleaxed by it. I was saying earlier, though, Connie comes around as the series goes forward. I mean, she kind of becomes I wouldn't say a surrogate wife exactly to Michael, but she does end up fulfilling some of the roles that a wife would fulfill in his life later on. And I'm not talking like Cersei, Jaime Lannister stuff, but just, certain roles that he needs fulfilled with kids and organizationally and stuff. And so I think she finally forgives him, or I don't know if she forgives him. She finally gets over it enough to do her part in the family, unlike Kay, of course. But now I'm getting into the Godfather part 2, and we are not there.
Yeah, I struggle. There's just so many great scenes, and I mean, I guess I'll be the one to do it. It's the head cut off in the bed. I mean, I think for me, I'm trying to put myself in the first time of watching the movie. I don't think people saw that coming. If you were sitting in the theater in 1973 or 1974, and then he touches the blood, you assume then maybe something else got cut off. Maybe they murdered him, and then maybe they murdered someone and put him in, and then it's the horse head. Oh man, that's the drama, the music, everything.
Rise horse.
Everything just builds it up to that level. And I think the novel, if you've read the novel and then you go into the movie, and he loved that horse more than he loved any person in his life, and they knew exactly what to do to get to him, and that was amazing.
Yeah, interesting fact about that scene is they made like a fake horse head for the scene, and Francis was like, this just doesn't work, like it's not going to work. So they actually got like a real horse's head that had been slaughtered, and they used that. That's why it looks real, because it is.
I don't want to know that.
And yeah, because it is real. And the one thing of this, like kind of like the blood looks really real. At that time, if you watch kind of movies from that time period, the blood kind of has like almost like kind of crayon quality, like melted crayon type look. And in that scene, it looks like real blood. Like it's dark, it's red.
Looks like it was.
Yeah.
So, but even like the scene I picked out earlier where Sonny gets shot up, right? The blood looks real. I mean, I'm trying to think of Dawn of the Dead came out, I believe, around this time, and it's famous for having like guys get shot and it literally looks like melted crayons are pouring out of them. Like it just looks terrible. And I mean, at the time, I mean, they didn't really have much money to work with and to make those movies in general, but it always kind of really took me out of the scene where it's, I don't know, it just looks so fake.
You mean in a movie about zombies taking over the world, you had a problem with your suspension of disbelief and the blood didn't look realistic?
It's just the crayon quality to it. I mean, honestly, you watch a bunch of films that come out around this time, the blood looks terrible. But in this film, it looks real. It looks great. Yeah, the horse's head thing was real. I also found that scene too is it does the Johnny Fontaine story, which I thought in the book that it was just way too much of that. I didn't really care too much for it. So, the lead up to the wedding, we get introduced to Johnny. We understand his problem. They go talk to the producer, and he's able to like kind of get all you need out of that story within, I don't know, how much screen time do you think it actually has? 20 minutes?
Chris and I have gone back and forth on this. I kind of liked the Johnny Fontaine story and the novel. If they had played it out, it just ended after they've devoted maybe a third of the novel about Johnny Fontaine. And then we get really no closure on Johnny Fontaine. The movie did tie Johnny Fontaine up in a nicer bow than the novel did.
Yeah, well, what's your opinion on it, Frank? Because I thought the movie did it perfectly, where it's just, we got the gist of it, we got the story told. I thought the novel, it was way too, I just didn't care for the character all that much, personally. And then they spent a huge chunk of the novel talking about him.
Yeah, I think you're both right. I think the movie did it fine. I remember thinking there's a bit much in the novel, but I was interested, and I don't remember how it ended up, which tells me it did not end very satisfyingly.
So I guess we'll go to probably my favorite scene is the actual shootout in the restaurant. I thought was brilliant the way they did it. And there's like couple little things about that scene too, where so when he goes to the bathroom where he's supposed to grab the gun, you kind of see him freak out a little bit because, oh, where's the gun, right? Because he's already freaking out in general, right? Because he's going to be shooting like a big mob guy and a chief of police, or it's not the chief of police. What is the captain, right? He's going to be shooting a police officer in general, which is a pretty big leap for him. This is his first making bones, right? Most of the time, most of these guys are killing, some other mobster that's going to be like ratting somebody out or did something terrible. I mean, these two characters, they were doing something terrible, but most times your first hit is not a cop. And he goes into the bathroom and he's reaching up to get the gun that's been placed there for him, and you can tell that he's freaking out a little bit because he's nervous, but he's also trying to find the gun. And Francis, apparently, they had agreed upon where the gun was going to be put underneath the toilet. Francis apparently said, move it a little bit to the left or the right. I can't remember. So it's not right there. So Al Pacino has a little moment there where he like freaks out for real. It's like, oh, am I going to screw up the scene? I can't find the gun. Just a little thing that Francis did to make the film feel authentic. And then he goes out and just cold blood just shoots both of them. Gone over it earlier in the film where he was supposed to drop the gun right away, and you could tell he's so petrified, he's so scared about what he had just done. He carries the gun for a little bit, and then he remembers, oh wait, I have to drop the gun. And it's at that moment that there's no turning back for Michael at all. He'd been leaning to it where he said, like, I'm with you, Dad. But there's no turning back at that point, right? Like, you just killed a police officer in a restaurant, with witnesses. That's Michael taking the final step, like, I'm going to become the head of the family, and this is a decision I've made. And sometimes in life, it's like that. You make a decision and there is no turning back, right? For good or bad.
Yeah, that's the point of no return. I think his decision was made there. I think you alluded to it at the hospital when he pretends to be muscle so that the hitters drive on, and then he goes and forces him to move his dad into a different room. I think that's where he made his decision, but he could have still changed his mind until he shot that captain. But again, another scene that has so many subtleties in it. You mentioned the gun grabbing thing. I didn't know that. That's excellent directing, if you ask me. That's awesome. But even the part where like Sollozzo tells Michael, or tells the captain McCloskey that, Michael and I are going to speak Italian. Please don't be offended. And he's like, and he starts eating his steak, right? And they speak Italian. Well, I mean, there's a purpose for that, right? I mean, he can honestly say, and he can pass a lie detector test if he were put on the box to say, I don't know what they talked about. I was there to make sure two people didn't hurt each other. I was asked to provide security. I didn't know anything was wrong with that. I don't have any idea what they talked about. And he's telling the truth. He doesn't know what they talked about, at least not specifically, because they spoke Italian. And so, you were talking about insulation and stuff earlier, Steve, and there's another example of it. It insulates McCloskey, the captain, the police captain, but it insulates Slotso and Michael too, because now he doesn't have something on them more than what he already had sitting down. He doesn't gain any new leverage because he has no new information other than the fact that they met. And so there's so many subtleties in this movie that are so well done. So I'm glad you picked that scene, Chris.
One thing that I liked about the movie, again, that I think did better in the book painted that captain as really like above and beyond corrupt. And so you didn't feel quite as bad with him getting killed. But the movie, yeah, he shouldn't have punched Michael, but I'm sure that's stuff that happened all the time in the 40s where a cop might take a cheap shot at somebody. You get the sense that he's just a run-of-the-mill cop, and then you do feel a little bit bad for him. I think that, and you feel like, whoa, Michael really has he's jumped the chasm here. It's not just that he's killing a really bad cop who, we don't care because he kind of had it coming. This is, in the movie, it's abundantly clear, icing this mafia tough guy, and then a cop, he's gone over to the dark side, and there's no going back after that. There's no redemption at all there.
I don't have much sympathy for the cop, though. I mean, Michael points out, he's getting involved in drug runners, dirty cop. Who cares, right? I don't know. I didn't feel much sympathy for him. That's my opinion, just because he was getting involved in drug runners. It wasn't like gambling or something of that nature. I mean, gambling's pretty bad too, but like drug running, I don't know, this maybe it's just like a personal thing with me. I'm like, I just have like almost zero sympathy for it. I don't know. How do you feel, Frank?
I agree with Steve. He was less he was not as dislikable in the film as he was in the book. And I agree with you, Chris. He had it coming, and I don't feel bad for him one bit. But I think the version of him in the book had it coming even more. So he wasn't a cop. He was a criminal. He was a criminal who managed to infiltrate the New York Police Department. I mean, that's really what he was.
The guy who played him, I'm not sure the actor's name. He did a fantastic job.
Yeah, I agree.
Just playing like the Irish cop, right? I thought he was great. And even like when you mentioned him hitting Michael, the makeup that they did on Michael to make his face look puffy Al Pacino's or whatever, and like kind of saggy, I thought that was really well done, because you could tell like he smacked him real good.
Yeah, I think in the book he had like a nasal drip issue for quite some time, or his eye dripped or something like that, and he had to constantly. You see in the movie he's carrying around a handkerchief, but like it was omnipresent in the book. I mean, it was constantly in your face that he had this issue going on, like he was always weeping or his nose was running or whatever it was. So yeah, I think you did a great job there pointing out, Chris, how he did it by the numbers, except he showed his rookie nature just a little bit by not dropping that gun right away. That's a really nice touch, because it showed that this was his first time. And yeah, he's cool under pressure, but the pressure's still there.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. I wonder if there was for either of you, if there was something you didn't really like about the movie, or something that you could point out that maybe irked you a little bit or thought could be better.
For me personally, this goes for the book and the movie. The whole stuff in Sicily, I didn't really care for. Francis fought really hard to get all that stuff filmed actually in Sicily. He was very insistent on it. I get it to a degree. Like it serves the purpose of the story. I just think it went on way too long. And I think there's some historical accuracy to that. Like Vito Genovese fled to Sicily to beat murder charges and hung out with Benito Mussolini for a bit. They were like best pals until they weren't. And then, Yeah, I didn't really care for the stuff in Sicily in the book and even the movie. I mean, I didn't really care for it either. I don't know. How do you guys feel?
I think that the fleeing to Sicily has a lot more of an impact on you as you're viewing the story if you were viewing it in the context of both movies together, because, you know, that's where Vito Corleone, actually Vito Andolini, right, came from, right? And so his son going back there in order to be safe, this place that he fled because he wasn't safe, there's kind of a sort of a poetic quality to that, sort of a what's old is new again thing going on there. So I think there's value in it in that regard. I think what I don't like about it is that they blow up Apollonia, and there was, you know, probably a good couple of years of my young life where I wanted to marry her. So she's dead in pieces. I couldn't do that. So, but I mean, what did poor Apollonia do? You know, she's just a village girl who fell in love with this Italian who, from America, who was struck by the thunderbolt when he saw her. And, you know, I mean, did she deserve to get blown up in the car? But it's good for his character because, you know, he's cold, but he wasn't cold with her. That was like the one place in his life. Like if she had lived, I think he would have been a very different person in the second movie. And even in the remainder of the first movie, she would have softened his edges. She would have given him joy. And that joy would have kept him from being as cold and calculating and ruthless as he is in the remainder of the movie. And in the second movie, I mean, he kills his, spoiler alert, he kills his own brother, you know, I mean, that's pretty cold.
Yeah.
I don't think he could have done that if he was happy with Apollonia and had children with her and had a family with her. And so her dying, I think, was essential to his character development, you know, but it, you know, sucked for her for my early matrimonial purposes.
I agree with both of you. I think that it was the scenes in Sicily and then the storyline with Apollonia was important, but it sure did feel like it dragged on. And I think that they could have gotten that maybe a little bit quicker of a time frame. It really dragged on in the book. It's like, come on, let's get a move on already.
Oh, sorry. It just seems like Mario Puzo was like trying to, because this is where all these mob guys came from, was from Sicily, and like Sicily is where, you know, the homeland of the mafioso and that type of thing. So of course it's got to go right back to Sicily. And I mean, the reality is, if you, I don't know, you look at Lucky Luciano, who's considered like one of the original guys of the mob, right? He didn't really have like a ton of connection to Sicily. Like when he got deported back to Sicily, which was like kind of part of the deal that he made, we discussed that on earlier podcasts. If Americans came by, he would just sit and talk to them because he felt like he missed hearing American accents. He felt more American than he did Sicilian. That's kind of that's what it felt like to me. Kind of a guy like thinking, oh, of course they have all these like tiebacks to Sicily and what have you. But I mean, the reality is, yeah, I'm sure some of these guys did, but a lot of them didn't.
I think one of the other things that bothered me about the book and the movie, and maybe I'm being picky here, but Tessio, right? Abe Vigoda's character, he was smart, you know, and they say, you know, yeah, Tessio's smart and this was the smart move. And Tessio was always smart. That's why he made this move to betray Michael. I just don't, that's one of the few things that happens in the book and in the movie that I think, oh, that he did that because the director and the writer needed that character to do that. Not necessarily because that character would have done that. I mean, the Corleone family were not so much on the ropes, I don't think, that Clemenza or Tessio would be thinking about, you know, turning traitor. I mean, they had such respect for the old man, and was he still alive at the time, or no? He had already died at that point, hadn't he? He died. That's another possible favorite scene too, the tomato scene with the grandson. But I don't know. Do you think, I mean, I get the logic that Puzo and Coppola used with the character, and it's not crazy. I don't think they're just manufacturing it, but I never bought it. I always felt like it was a little bit contrived.
Yeah, it seemed contrived to force the ending, that they needed something to definitively end it and then move forward. And it happened, it unfolded really quickly, or too quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I almost wish they would have, and maybe I don't remember if they did in the book. Perhaps it's been a while since I've read it. I wish they would have given Tessio a little bit more motivation other than, oh, this is the smart play because probably the Barzinis are going to take over and the Corleones are going to be dead and I want to land on my feet, blah, blah, blah. That just seems too cold for somebody that's been with the family for so long. And so it'd be nice if, usually you can find reasons, like maybe Clemenza got promoted over the top of him and he had a burr under his saddle because he thought he was smarter than Clemenza and deserved to be the leader. And, kind of like Tom Hagen was told, you're not going to be consigliere because you're not Italian, or you're not a wartime consigliere. So you're out, I mean, he got a burr under his saddle about that. And had he gone and turned state's evidence or something, at least there's a reason there for it other than it's quote unquote the smart move.
Yeah.
But that's obviously I'm picking at very small nits right now.
Chris, what do you think for yours? Is there anything you would nitpick on?
Yeah, other than the Sicily stuff, that's the only stuff that I just felt like I didn't really care too much for. One thing that kind of bothers me in general is just that's not so much of the movie itself. Is a lot of people get this impression that the mob or parts of the mob were not involved in drug trafficking, which is just because of this movie, and it's just not true. Like, they were all involved in drug trafficking pretty much right from the get-go.
Probably too lucrative not to be.
Well, that's exactly it, right? They even talked about it in the movie, right? Where, the Corleone family is going to be taking a huge hit. They're walking away from money based on principles that they don't want to get involved in drug trafficking. But the reality is all the mob families in New York and right across the states and up here in Canada and across the world are all involved in drug trafficking. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, So if you see like your neighborhood's being flooded with drugs, especially say if you live in Sicily or what have you, good chance that the mob isn't directly involved in that. Probably maybe a little less so now, just because they're just not as powerful in the States as they used to be. They're still quite powerful, but not as much as they used to be. And that's something that just always irks me because I still hear it to this day. It's like, well, they're not all involved. And I'm like, no, they're all involved in drug trafficking. There's no argument about that. And it just always bothered me. I get it for storytelling purposes for The Godfather. It makes sense because immediately it makes you sympathetic to the family. It's just not reality.
I think that one of my quibbles about the movie is that Fredo really turned into a weenie, really, when you boil it down. I don't feel like he had any real stake. He was sort of just another foil to a ball guy character that he isn't tough enough to defend the Don. And I think they were trying to go with him in a slightly different direction in the book, and they spent so much time developing Johnny Fontaine that we never got to really know much about Fredo. And I think Fredo could have been a much bigger part of the film and the book.
I'll say this: the guy who played Fredo, he looks like, I don't know the actor's name right off the top of my head, but he has a face that you just kind of want to punch. He just looks unlikable. Do you know what I mean? Like he just looks like a guy you would not trust.
He always plays those characters too. He's in The Deer Hunter, if you remember, and he plays a very similar. Basically, plays Fredo in The Deer Hunter as well.
John Cazale.
Yeah, he would have been John Cazale. Yeah, he would have been. He would have been a more interesting character to see fleshed out. I think for sure. I mean, he was somebody that I think didn't get enough credit for being able to glad hand people. But unfortunately, he didn't have enough strength of personality. I mean, you had Mo Green slapping him around for getting waitresses pregnant or whatever it was. And, I mean, if you're the son of a Don, you probably shouldn't be getting smacked around by anybody. So that, it's unfortunate that his fatal flaw was, that weakness of character, but he had strengths too. And he's criminally underused and not trusted. And that comes up again in the second movie quite a bit.
And just his look, I don't know. He just looks like a guy that I would just not trust with anything. And that's probably why they casted him, right?
It's great casting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm assuming they probably were. I don't know for sure if they were thinking about a second one, but when they were filming this one, I guess it was going to be based largely on the success of this one. I know Francis was not initially. He was not interested in doing the second movie, and I believe it was a producer or something told him, it's like, hey, you have like the formula for Coca-Cola and you're telling me that you don't want to make it or something. And then it's like, and that's what convinced him. It's like, well, I'd be stupid not to direct the second movie.
Well, there was still story to be told from the book too, right? So why wouldn't you? And yeah, I'm surprised to hear that. I'm surprised he was resistant. But this was, was it 72 and 74 that they came out? Does that sound right? I mean, sequels were not a big thing back then. They were just getting rolling where the idea of a sequel, like now, it's a done deal. If the movie is moderately successful and there's any room in the story for a second movie, they make it because it's a proven commodity, blah, blah, blah. But back in the early 70s, I mean, the idea of a sequel wasn't, Star Wars didn't come out for another 5 years, So, it just wasn't it was getting there. And certainly I think the second Godfather movie, people were like, well, hey, if the Godfather can do it, we can do it. And then they made like 2 Every Which Way But Loose and Any Which Way You Can with Clint Eastwood. Some movies got sequels that maybe weren't quite as high quality. But although those were fun to watch, I remember. So I guess what I'm saying is that it surprises me, A, that he wasn't interested, and B, that it wasn't a done deal because it wasn't the kind of thing that happened all the time back then. And so, it was a little bit of breaking the mold by making a second movie as opposed to, moving on to break new ground.
Well, I think we're ready to close out The Godfather, at least Godfather Part 1. There's still 2 and 3 to go, but that will be a different story for a different day. I know I've enjoyed talking about The Godfather.
Yeah, I've had a blast. I had a great time researching the making of The Godfather and how it came about and the direct involvement that the mob had in the making of The Godfather, and just researching just how important The Godfather is in terms of cinema history, but also mob history. Many of the perceptions that we have of the mafia come from the movie Godfather. Many sayings we talked about it earlier in the show. Bada Bang, and there's a couple of others. Come directly from this movie, and yeah, and just the influence that it's had on pop culture and popular imagination on the mafia and mob history in general.
Well, you did a fantastic job on the research piece there, Chris. You really got your mustache into it and dug out a lot of great info. I'm impressed. You know way more about the history of this than I do for sure. But I still enjoyed discussing it because, for me, with my background as a writer, it's about, how the story is told. And while the telling of the story, it's different in the medium of film as a connoisseur, as just a movie watcher, I can still appreciate how, oh wow, they're telling the story really well in a way that can only be done in a movie. Whereas, in a novel or a play or, some other type of production, you would be telling it maybe differently. And it's such a compelling story, a family drama, a crime drama. And it's very Greek. It's a Greek tragedy, really. I mean, if you think about it, and you don't have to think very hard to get there, it's very much a Greek tragedy. And Michael is, he is Theseus, he is Oedipus, he is, pick your Greek hero. And so I've really enjoyed, getting into that kind of stuff, and then listening to the research that Chris dug up, and your insight, Steve, has been, fun just from a listening standpoint.
And we would definitely like to hear what everybody out there has to say. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there with a lot of opinions on The Godfather. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, go tell a friend, tell a couple of friends, tell all of your friends, so that your friends can become friends of ours.